Yeah. Greetings to the mighty name of His Imperial Majesty Emperor and Selassie I first. See? Now as promised, I'm gonna do a reading from a book named Born for Dead, written by one Laurie Gunst, an American. See? Now the inspiration for this series is based on I'm on knowledge of a character named Bones that I've made representations of in the series Dance of WARIEKA Hills. You get what I say? But interestingly, there's some statements, some arguments in this book here that needs observation. I need, pay attention to given to the fact that there was external knowledges of a certain situation that wasn't really recognized or paid much attention by international authorities who could have probably bring to bear some level of justice in regards to the people. But let me begin with my grade 7 level reading. All in school reading, see? So bear with me. When I began working on this book a decade ago, I conceived of it as both a work of history and a traveler's tale, the story of Jamaica's political gangs and the record of my journey into their labyrinth. This story began in the ghettos of Kingston, a chessboard of war zone with human pieces. For as long as the majority of Jamaicans can remember, politicians have armed and paid Kingston's most notorious gunmen to enforce their rule in the capital city's thronged slums. The worst of the violence came between 1975 and 1980. So it seemed to me as I set out on this journey that the heyday of the gangs was in the past. And I thought that saga of the process, as the gangs have come to be called, ended where it had begun in Jamaica. When I moved to Kingston in 1984, the downtown ghettos were quiet and the sufferers, the honorific title that Jamaicans give to the poorest of their poor, the ones with the courage and resourcefulness to endure, were still recovering from the undeclared civil war of the 1980 election. The death toll from that campaign has never been officially tallied. But Michael Manley, Jamaica's Prime Minister at the time, dedicated his 1982 book, Struggle in the Periphery, to the memory of 750 people who died so needlessly, many in their first flower of youth. This was his epitaph for a generation that was sacrificed to the fires of Jamaica's political strife. I began moving with the sufferers at a time that superficially resembled a period of healing and peace. It seemed like a good time to begin writing the untold story of the tribal gunmen who had fought for Manley and Siaga, his arch-rival. The secret symbiosis between the politicians and their mercenaries has always been a dangerous subject in Jamaica. But it seemed a little less so after Siaga had defeated Manley and his new right-wing regime began restoring the island to America's favor. But the lull was ominous and deceptive. Even as I sat in rum shops and tenement yards, watching young men light glass pipes of crack instead of ganja they would have smoked in a Miller time, I was already hearing the first rumors of an outlaw exodus to the American promised land. The Rankings, who had controlled Kingston for Manley and Siaga through the 70s, were leaving their ghetto hells for the cities of the United States, transforming their island gang alliance into mainland drug posses. This is a story without an end. As I write this introduction, placing an arbitrary punctuation mark in an ongoing saga, I have just spoken with a reporter from the Miami Herald, Lisette Alvarez, who called this morning to interview me about yet another posse massacre. This time, 4 people were shot dead at a Dade County dance hall. One of the victims was a girl who was celebrating her 17th birthday. 18 people were wounded when gunmen opened fire with the Glock 9mm handguns that have become the trademark weapon of the gangs. Alvarez told me the Miami police were still uncertain about the motive for the shootings, but they thought the fight was sparked when two men from rival posses argued over who had fathered a woman's child. The U.S. Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms has been tracking the posses since the mainland debut in the early 1980s, and it now report that the gang have killed 4,500 people in the United States since then. The gunmen began migrating to America just after the 1980 election in Jamaica. By that time, the Kingston top-ranking mercenaries have already begun trafficking in homegrown marijuana and transshipped cocaine. They soon branched out from Jamaica into American market, and the money they made from the drug trade snapped the leash that had once bound them to their politician patrons. The party leaders, menaced by an outlaw underworld they could no longer control, turned the Jamaican police loose in the ghettos to execute their former paladins. This reign of terror sent posse men by the hundreds on the run to the United States. They brought with them a killer enthusiasm honed by years of warfare with one another and the police. And when they came onto America's main streets, they were afraid of no one. Their timing was superb. The Jamaican posses quickly proved themselves indispensable to the Colombians, Cubans, and Panamanians who controlled the supply of cocaine and needed street-level dealers to sell the cheap new product called crack. But long before the posses began migrating to America, they were learning bad guys style from movies. These island desperados are the bastard offspring of Jamaica's violent political shitstorm, as the Rastafari long ago dubbed it, and the gunslinger ethos of American movies. They are a Caribbean cultural hybrid, tropical bad boys acting out fantasies from spaghetti westerns, kung fu, kill flicks, Rambo sequels, and Godfather spin-offs that play nightly in Kingston's funky movie houses and flicker constantly behind the young men's eyes. The posse men see themselves as Clint Eastwood in Dirty Harry, Al Pacino in Scarface, or, if they are old enough to remember the 1960s, the rampaging misfits from Sam Peckinpah's Wild Bunch. I was captivated by this crazy synthesis between Hollywood and Jamaica's Johnny Two Bad Renegades. It was my favorite. It was my way into the culture of this outlaw world. I moved to Kingston to teach history at the University of the West Indies, but my real purpose was to write the secret history of the gunmen and their links with Jamaica's elected leaders. I had been going to the island for almost 10 years, long enough to know something of downtown Kingston from reggae musicians and Rastafari elders. The lyric poets of rebellion, but it was a far cry from backstage encounters with Bob Marley or Jimmy Cliff. Let me read a part there again before. I moved to Kingston to teach history at the University of the West Indies, but my real purpose was to write the secret history of the gunmen and their links with Jamaica's elected leaders. I had been going to the island for almost 10 years, long enough to know something of Jamaica's Kingston from reggae musician and Rastafarian elders, the lyric of poets of rebellion. But it was a far cry from backstage encounters with Bob Marley or Jimmy Cliff to the ghettos that spawned their music, a distant measure by the boundaries of colour and caste. Years before I came to UWI, a visiting Australian lecturer was stabbed to death at the Palace Movie Theatre downtown by a famous criminal named Donovan Chinkwe, a half-Chinese outlaw who worked on and off for Edward Seaga's Jamaica's Labour Party. No one on campus had forgotten this slaying, and my colleagues warned me to stay out of the places where the sufferers lived. Not one of us had any reason whatsoever for venturing into certain parts of this city, said the timid East Indian professor from whom I rented a house. And if we do, we get what we deserve. Us and them, the line of demarcation, never to be crossed. That separated the downtown poor from the fearful but fortunate uptowners. But I had a reason for crossing this line. The Jamaican sufferers came from the same tradition as greats of West Africa. They are storyteller historians who preserve the legends of a people, and they alone are the keepers of the posse's saga. I couldn't chronicle the exploits of gang leaders who were also Robin Hood heroes in the ghettos unless I went to stand with the sufferers on common ground. Downtown Kingston was the foundation for everything I had wanted to understand about Jamaica since my first trip in the island in 1976. That initiation coincided with the years when a fiery and eloquent politician named Michael Manley began leading his People's National Party (PNP) and Jamaica into a post-colonial reckoning with the past. The island had gained its independence from Great Britain scarcely a decade before, in 1962, and it was struggling to come to grips with a legacy of slavery and colonialism that persisted with vengeance. The decade of the 1970s was a fever dream of race consciousness and high hopes. The first time in Jamaican history when the downside reality of sufferation gave the lie to the island's polite British parliamentary facade. As reggae music and Rastafari and redemption put Jamaica on the world's cultural map, its deep and painful schisms between rich and poor, light-skinned and dark, was forced out into the open as never before. In an anguished reprisal of the past, islanders began confronting the truth of a history that Peter Tosh lamented as 400 years. 4 centuries of Babylonian captivity for the black race in Jamaica and the Americas. At the same time, Manley took up the larger struggle of small, underdeveloped third world states against the overwhelming dominance of the old and new colonial powers. Even as Manley's PNP raised this banner, Edward Seaga began turning the rival Jamaica Labour Party in a reactionary force, thundering against Manley's warming friendship with Fidel Castro and his brave but foolhardy support for Maynard third world insurgents. The United States embraced Seaga with predictable favor. The American eagle hovered fiercely over Jamaica's doomed experiment in democratic socialism and eventually rooted it with the same method of the State Department and the Central Intelligence Agency had used elsewhere. The American press painted a harsh portrait of the island. The International Monetary Fund (IMF) devalued Jamaica's currency and destabilized an economy already battered by the oil price shock of the 70s. And travel agents discouraged their clients from going to Jamaica, thereby crippling the industry on which the island depended for its survival. And a tide of high-powered weapons flowed like bloody currency from the United States into the hands of political gunmen. Jamaicans were traumatized by the rising violence, but only a few dare to suggest that the killing was done at the behest of elected leaders. Jamaica became yet another theater of the worldwide Cold War. The island's contortions were a claustrophobic replay of those in Chile, in Nicaragua, and in a dozen other outposts of strife where superpowers played out their east-west death dance. This drama not only went on in the corridors of the State Department, the World Bank, the IMF, it played constantly in the rubbly streets of Kingston, where Manley and Seaga armed their rival posses to maintain control of political constituencies in a tangle of slums and shantytowns. It was this misery that claimed my heart and mind. I was then working on my doctorate in Harvard, in history at Harvard, shuttling back and forth between the tumult of Jamaica and the cool battleship grey stacks of Widener Library. My dissertation was on the origin of African slave trade to the Spanish Caribbean, and there was for me a certain resonance between this bitter history and Jamaica's contemporary reckoning. Every trip I took to the island showed me a present heavy with the burden of the past. Okay. Every trip I took to the island showed me a present heavy with the burden of the past. Jamaica became my teachment, as it has for thousands of other watchers and listeners around the world. It is an island with a densely compact history that contains every movement of consequence in the Western Hemisphere. Native societies devastated by European conquest, the extermination of Aboriginal peoples and their replacement by African slaves, the long sleep of colonialism and the slow, painful awakening in the struggle for nationhood. This is a small island, Jamaicans like to say of their mountainous country, but it's big like hell in the middle. Its history is similarly grand. The island insistence voice yanked me again and again out of the safety and removal I was learning to mistrust in academia and into the place my two comfortable colleagues blithely referred to as the real world. As I listened transfixed to the ramblings, apocalyptic lectures fired at me by Rastafarian visionaries or the headmen of smut. Read that again. As I listened to transfixed to the ramblings, apocalyptic lectures fired at me by Rastafarian visionaries or the headmen of small villages deep in the Jamaican bush, I came to see that these men were giving me history lessons every bit as crucial as the ones I was hearing in the Harvard Yard. Buried for years in archives of dead voices, I began learning the dangers and delights of listening to the living. In many ways, the risky work that I found later, venturing mapless into the unknown terrains of the posses, was just the logical extension of looking for truth in the places where my first Jamaican instructors taught me to look. I remember being summoned for the first time in the myriad contradictions of Jamaica's colonial past by an old man named Monroe in the tiny village of Accompong. It was the feast of the Epiphany in January 6, 1976, and Accompong was holding its annual celebration in honor of its founder, a rebel slave named Kojo. Kojo's people fought two guerrilla wars with the British in the 18th century and won their freedom 100 years before Queen Victoria gave it to the rest of England's slaves. The colonizers called these rebels Maroons, a corruption of the Spaniard word Cimarron, meaning wild or untamed. Their descendants are still living in 5 autonomous Maroon townships scattered across Jamaica's mountainous interior. And Accompong is their proudest community. Monroe was then keeper of its traditions and its history. He and I sparred together for the better part of the day in his small house, knocking back glasses of overproof white rum, man loved and reasoning about the tangled history of England and Jamaica. There were framed pictures of Queen Elizabeth and Winston Churchill on man's wall. Oh gosh. And late in the day, I asked him why he honored these modern British incarnation of the power his people had long ago fought to a standstill. Without a word, he rose and fetched his copy of the treaty that Kojo had made with the British in 1939. He turned its pages to the place where Kojo had signed with an X. "Young miss," man said, pointing to the photographs. We and those people up there are of one spirit. Once it was for us to fight the English for our freedom. And then time come for man and man. Then time come for Matt man. So Winston Churchill to stand firm for all the world against the Hitler business. Same spirit. It's only time separate us. Man smiled. History is a mystery sometimes, he said. By the end of the 70s, after many trips to Jamaica and my first tentative foray into Kingston, it was the mystery of Jamaica's worsening tribal war that caught and held me. It seemed that every time I opened a gleaner, the island's daily paper, there was a story about a killing in downtown Kingston that was said to be the work of one political activist or another. Some Johnny Too Bad, who was rumored to be working for the PNP or the JLP, who was the shadowy PNP enforcer named Winston Burry Boy Blake, and why was he so powerful that Michael Manley himself chose to join Blake's funeral procession in 1975 after the gunman had been shot dead by a JLP supporter in West Kingston. Snipers from the JLP fire on that cortege as it snaked its way past Tivoli Gardens, Siaga's own West Kingston in fiefdom. Who were the political mercenaries who set fire to a PNP tenement yard on Orange Street one hot May night in 1976 and then shot the firefighters who tried to extinguish the blaze? 11 people died and 500 were left homeless. This viciousness was made even more surreal by the Gleaners' gutless response to it. No one dared to name Manley or Siaga as the men behind such outrages. Rumors flew and whispers floated from Kingston uptown verandas. Downtown, the sufferers burned and bled. The gunmen infused their cruelty with a certain cinematic style, a cool detachment from the agony they inflicted. Most of these paladins had come of age in the 1950s and 60s, when Hollywood churned out countless westerns, and Jamaicans began a long love affair with the legendary bandits of the silver screen. No one who has any Perry Hensel's 1973 masterpiece, The Harder They Come, No one who has seen Perry Hensel's 1973 masterpiece, The Harder They Come, can forget the scene where its country boy hero Ivan O'Martin came to Kingston hungry for fame as a singer and goes to his first movie in town. He and a new city slick friend are at the palace watching a rot-gut spaghetti western called Django, starring Franco Nero, and the audience of young people is mesmerized by the violence. As the light from the screen flicker across their ardent faces, they watch Nero crouch behind a log in the mud of some nameless frontier town, facing down a posse of white-hooded vigilantes who start towards him with their guns cocked, laughing. Ivan holds his breath, certain that the hero is doomed, until another kid in the audience mocked Ivan's naivety. Hero can't dead till last reel, the kid whispered. And he's right. Nero leaped up from behind the log with a Gatling gun and mowed down the whole posse. The Kingston audience howled with delight. They know the rules of this game. At the end of his own last reel, when Ivan is a hunted outlaw himself, he makes his final stand on a deserted beach near Kingston. Cornered by a squadron of soldiers, he flashes back to that scene from Django and staggers out from the cover, shouting for a fair chance to shoot it out with the Jamaica Defense Force. Just send one out, man, he yells. One man who can draw. He clutches his revolver, but the soldiers cut him down in a barrage of machine gun fire. Like hundreds of Jamaican gangsters before and after, he lives and dies with gunslingers He lives and dies with gunslinger's bravado acquired from the movies. I discovered the power of that myth as I came to know the gunmen and sufferers of Kingston. We shared an affinity with the Wild West, and this carried us across many a cultural bridge. There were night-long sessions of talk that was accompanied by ancient, scratchy jukebox blaring tunes by Western balladeers like Marty Robbins and Tex Ritter. They were veteran outlaws who were brought to tears by ghost riders in the sky. There was a tense afternoon in a shantytown near Kingston where I had gone to meet a ranking nicknamed Billy the Kid, who was very reluctant to talk to me until someone mentioned that I had only recently come to Jamaica from Wyoming. Why? Billy breathed in a reverent whisper. I know about that place. Enough bad man come from out there. Hole in the wall, Butch Cassidy and Sundance Kid. Of course, I had been wrong to assume that the Posse saga ended in Kingston. By the time I left the island in 1986, the gang were well established in the United States. Their Jamaican beginning were in some ways only a prologue to what they became here, an apprenticeship in the ways of badness. But they had been taught essential lessons in Jamaica by the politicians who used them, by the police who gunned them down when their brief period of usefulness was over, and by a poverty from which death is often the only release. If you are a Jamaican youth who expects to die before you reach 20, but find that somehow your 9 lives keep spinning out one after another in a miraculous reprieve, it isn't that hard to summon up the nerve to carve out a niche as a street warrior in the American drug trade. If you are a Kingston sufferer living inside the hells that being created for you by the greed and folly of the United States and the corrupt establishment of your own country, it is logical that you will do anything to get out. Only sufferer's rage can be contained for a while. The sufferer's rage can be contained for a while in the shantytowns of Kingston, but sooner or later they will bring it here, for this is their frontier, and then one can follow them, as I did, into their American Higuera. But then on streets where there is nothing but the drug trade, and then there is gun. No. But then on street where there is nothing but the drug trade, and then chosen the gun, the ones meant for combat, assault rifle, rapid fire weapons like Uzi and Glock, which let off an orgasmic spurt of bullets, enough to drop at least a few people. Remember that some of these youths have never held a gun before, but others are experienced killers. It doesn't really matter if you are in the line of fire. It's your turn to die. And if you live, you can bear witness to the power of the posses. Rastafari, I hope that delivery was acceptable. See. Yes, I share, like, and subscribe. More blessed. I don't know, we are continuing reading with the first chapter. This was just the introduction to the book, Born for Dead. See? Much respect. Mad love.